Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to what is probably going to be a bit of a ramble. Today we're going to be talking about what our imaginations do as we read. We're going to be talking about subvocalization and visualization and like how imagination might affect reading. I feel like this video is probably going to be a bit rambly, so, you know, grab yourself a cup of tea and let's have a chat. I have been inspired to make this video for a couple of reasons. Basically, last week, probably, maybe 2 weeks ago, depending on when I post this, I put up a video talking about like how and why I read a lot of books, and I mentioned kind of in passing that I'm a very fast reader, and I was saying that I think one of the reasons why I read quite fast is because I don't have much of a visual imagination, so I'm not really like forming mental images as I read. And I found the response in the comments to this fact really, really interesting. Lots of people saying that they didn't have a visual imagination or that they did, and how that might affect their reading speed or how that affected their experience of reading. And so I put up like a poll on YouTube in the kind of community bit saying, oh, do you have a visual imagination or not? And how does this affect your reading speed? And the kind of response to that was really interesting, both in the comments and what people were voting. And a few people were speaking in the comments about subvocalization versus visualization. And then I put up another poll saying, you know, do you subvocalize when you read? Do you read the words aloud in your head as you read a book? And I just found the responses to this really, really fascinating. So I thought I would make a video about it. I'm also going to link down below in the description a video that Jennifer Loves Books made on the similar topic last week, which I really, really enjoyed and found really interesting. She was talking about her experience of reading in relation to these things, and I just found that fascinating too. I feel like I'm really, really interested in what people's brains do as they read. Obviously I am like not a scientist. I know nothing about psychology and biology. I don't know what actually happens in your brain as you read, but I do find it really interesting to think about and talk about how people's experience of reading differs in terms of like what's going on in their mind or imagination as they read. So I feel like today we're gonna have a ramble of that. My only like point of reference is my own experience and like the polls I put on BookTube, which are, you know, a very small bookish sample, but I feel like we could still have an interesting chat. So the first thing I want to talk about is visualization and reading. So when I read, I don't really like see anything in my mind. Like there aren't really any like mental visual images going on in my head as I read or as I write. I don't really have much of a visual imagination. So there is something called aphantasia, which is when you have like no visual element to your thinking. I don't think I'd fall into the aphantasia category because I do have a visual memory, and I also, it's not that I have no visual imagination at all, it's just that it's like very, very slim. So I found online a kind of like aphantasia test graphic, which I think is quite helpful for understanding what aphantasia means, and also possibly for understanding how your own visual imagination works. So I'll put it up on the screen. You can see it's got like 1 to 5, 1 being like your mind's eye can like conjure up something perfectly, and 5 being like there's no image in your head at all. This graphic comes from a website called Creative Revolution. I'll link that down below, and they have kind of more information about aphantasia on that page just in case you're interested. I find this stuff really interesting. I would say I'm not at number 5 on that category, but I'm probably like a 4.5 for visual imagination. Like very occasionally I might have some dim and vague image, but it's very rare and it's not like my regular experience. I feel like that's a scale for like a visual imagination rather than for memory, because I would say that my memory is, it's not exactly dim and vague. Like I have a visual memory and the visual images are like realistic, but they're like inconsistent and flickering. You know, I remember people's faces and scenes or like a thing that I saw, but it's always a bit like flickery, like I can't quite grasp onto it and hold it. Like I can't draw anyway, but even if I could draw, I wouldn't be able to like draw someone's face from memory. Leaving aside drawing because I can't draw, I wouldn't be able to like write a very, very detailed description of something I'd seen that I saw 2 days ago if I couldn't see it again, because I wouldn't be able to like hold the image in my head for long enough. Weirdly, I have really, really visually vivid dreams, which I usually like remember when I first wake up, and then they tend to fade like later in the day, or again, like I've got a memory of them, but it's like a bit inconsistent and I can't quite grab hold of it. And I find it very interesting that I have really, really visually vivid dreams, because I don't have much of a visual imagination, but obviously I do somewhere in my subconscious, but it's not like something I can access except when I'm asleep, maybe? I don't know. So anyway, let's talk a bit more about reading and writing and not having a visual imagination. So I would say that like 95% of the time when I'm reading, when I'm writing, is just the words. I have quite a strong audio imagination, which I'm going to talk about later on in the video, but for the most part, I don't really see anything like visually. I'm not really visually imagining anything when I'm reading. Because I have a visual memory, sometimes if I'm reading a book that I have seen a screen adaptation of or seen an illustration of, then I will have images in my head as I read. But only sometimes, like not for the whole book. Occasionally an image will like flash in my head. So for example, say I were reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which is a book I've read lots of times, and I've also seen the 2005 film and the 1995 miniseries lots of times. So when I'm reading Pride and Prejudice, if there is a line in the book where like the wording is the same in one of the screen adaptations, occasionally I will like have the screen actor's face in my head. But like not all the time, not very often, and it would definitely vary depending on the line, whether it was someone from the 1995 one or the 2005 one. But actually, the thing that I have most in my head when I read Pride and Prejudice is the illustrations in this edition. So this edition from the Collector's Library has like little illustrations in. And I think because I've read this edition lots of times and read it as a teenager, my visual memory of the illustrations is like quite good. So sometimes when I'm reading Pride and Prejudice, I do have like a visual image in my head of the illustrations from this book, especially this one. I feel like every time I get to the proposal scene in Pride and Prejudice, I do have this image in my head. So like occasionally I have like visual memory images when I read, but I'm not like creating any visual imagination images when I read. I would say very occasionally I do get like a visual image when I read, but it's very rare. You know, people were saying in the comments to that video and on the polls that when they read, it's like a film or a play or a TV show acting out in their head, which I can't even like imagine what that would be like. It's definitely not like that for me. If I ever do have a visual image, it's like someone has taken a screenshot from a film, only one, and they're showing it to me through frosted glass and then they're taking it away really fast. That's like all I get if I get a visual image when I read, and that only happens very, very rarely. So for example, when I was reading The Mars House by Natasha Pulley, I think I had that twice, where I had like a freeze frame image very briefly, very fuzzy, it was gone. But that happens like very rarely. Like The Mars House is the only book I can really think of that I've read this year where I had that kind of visual image in my head as I read. And even then, like I said, it was like two images, two screenshots that like vanished afterwards. So in general, when I'm reading, like there's no film in my head, there's no play going on. There is nothing visual happening when I read except for me like looking at the page. I also wanted to briefly talk about writing, because I feel like maybe people imagine that writers all have like a really vivid visual imagination, but I don't think that is true. Interestingly, one of the first things that like made me aware of aphantasia as a thing was John Green, who is a writer and a YouTuber from Vlogbrothers, posted something on Twitter saying that he was like 5 on the aphantasia scale, that he had aphantasia and, you know, had no visual imagination at all. So when I'm writing, again, as when reading, I don't really have a visual imagination. I would say I get that like freeze frame through frosted glass more when I write, but again, not very often. Like, I don't know what any of my characters look like really, unless I've written on the page what hair colour they have, then I don't know, I haven't decided. Usually if I need to describe something visually, then I need some kind of visual aid. So for example, I have a new book coming out in July, The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, and there are a lot of like big grand houses in it. So for every big grand house in The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, I googled National Trust and English Heritage properties that were built in the the right years for the houses and that were the right size, and I described them. And in fact, when the book is out, if you have a look at the map, you can see that all the houses on the map are like different shapes. And one of the reasons why they're different shapes is because I sent the guy who was illustrating the map the names of the real houses that I had based all the houses in Wickenshire off, so he could use the shapes of the actual houses, which I thought was really fun. And I do a similar thing, kind of if I need to describe, I don't know, a piece of furniture, then I like go to antiques websites and look up furniture from the time. And you describe like a dress or what someone's wearing, I usually Google Victorian fashion plates. Like if I need to describe something in a lot of visual detail, then I usually do need some kind of visual aid to help me on my way. I also often draw maps or floor plans when I'm writing. So obviously you just saw the map in The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst, which is very beautiful. That comes from a map that I drew, which is not very beautiful, but was very useful for me to work out where everything was. And if I'm writing a book which is mostly set in one house, then I usually have a like big floor plan. I had a floor plan for the Secrets of Hartwood Hall, so that I knew where all the rooms were. And I guess maybe you don't need that as much if you have a visual imagination, I don't know. I actually think it's quite useful as a writer to not have a visual imagination, because I feel like for some writers it's quite hard to like get the image you have in your head on the page or like into the mind of another reader, whereas like I have no visual image in my head, so it's not on the page unless I'm creating it on the page. And also like because my imagination is just words for the most part, that means like I'm always writing stories in my head rather than like seeing a scene in my head that I'm trying to put into words. Like what's in my head is the words anyway, so maybe that helps, I don't know. Moving back to reading, I also kind of wanted to think about how my visual imagination affects how I read. As I said in the previous video, I do wonder if it means that I read faster because I'm not like imagining things visually in my head. I also wonder if it's why I don't love like really, really lyrical, overly descriptive books or like more literary fiction. For example, I usually don't find like similes or metaphors or any kind of like imagery very powerful in books. And I do wonder if that is because I have no visual imagination, so I'm not like putting images together to make things, I don't know. I was thinking, I love Thomas Hardy, he's one of my favourite writers, but so many people, the thing they love about Thomas Hardy is his nature writing, and I'm like, I have zero interest in his nature writing, that does nothing for me. I'm fascinated by how his people interact with landscape and how the particular landscapes these people live in affect their communities, but the actual like nature writing does nothing for me at all. And I wonder if that's because I don't have a visual imagination, so I can't like do anything with the way he describes nature. Sorry if the camera's moved, I had to plug in my camera so it didn't run out of battery because I have already been talking for a while. Anyway, I feel like not having much of a visual imagination doesn't really like affect my enjoyment of reading at all. Like I love reading so much because I love stories and words, and I never really feel the lack of a visual imagination. Like I said, I do occasionally get like a visual freeze frame that's gone when I'm reading, but it's not very often, and I don't feel like my reading experience has been any less good if I don't get that. In fact, I can only think of like one book that I have read where I felt my lack of a visual imagination, and that is Dune by Frank Herbert. And I think that was because the world building is quite complicated and also really fascinating, but I couldn't really grasp the world. I think partly because I didn't have visual imagination, and actually having seen the 2 Dune films in the last few years, I love those films. I think they're fantastic, and I got so much more out of the films than the book. And I don't think that is entirely to do with visual imagination stuff. I also think it's to do with the depiction of the female characters, etc. But I feel like I loved the films so much more, partly because the world just like looked amazing, and I didn't get that from the book, which maybe you would from the book if you had a really strong visual imagination. I don't know. In general though, I feel like my very limited visual imagination like doesn't get in the way of my enjoyment of reading at all. Maybe it does mean I get on with certain books less well, maybe it does mean I read faster, but I feel like those would be the main effects on my reading. So let me turn to my poll about visual imagination because I found this really, really interesting. So of my BookTube sample of 837 people who probably, I guess, all read more than average people because we're all here watching BookTube, And, you know, this is obviously a very small sample of people and probably doesn't represent people as a whole, but I still found it interesting. I found it really interesting that 58% of people said they had a more visual imagination, 20% of people said they didn't have much of a visual imagination, and then, you know, the rest of the people said they were somewhere in the middle. I knew some people had a very visual imagination, but I feel like I don't think I realised it was most people. And maybe it's not most people. 58% of people isn't that big a majority, and like I said, very small sample of bookish people. I also feel like from my questions about like slow reading versus fast reading, it feels like there was a correlation between having a vivid visual imagination and being a slower reader, but there was like less of a correlation between not having much of a visual imagination and how fast or slow you read. More people who said they didn't have much of a visual imagination said they were faster readers, but also there was a much like smaller gap between those two statistics than between the vivid visual imaginations and fast and slow readers. Obviously, again, like I said, a very small bookish sample that doesn't tell us that much about the grand scheme of things, but I still found it fascinating. I also found the comments like really, really interesting, both on this poll and from the video where I'd spoken about not having much of a visual imagination. Like the amount of people saying that when they read, they see in their mind like a film or a movie or a play or a TV show, that their visual imagination is that vivid that it's like they're watching something. I found that fascinating because I just can't imagine what it was like. Someone even said that their imagination is so vivid visually that when they're looking back on something later, they can't remember if they read a book or saw a film. I also found it really interesting, people saying like what they did and didn't visualize. So some people said they saw buildings or places much more clearly than they saw characters in their heads, or some people said they saw characters much more clearly, or some people said they saw like protagonists, main characters, much more clearly than side characters. And a lot of people said it kind of depended on the author or the writing style. Some people also said that they visualize just like naturally or automatically as they read, and then for some people they said it takes more effort and it's like a purposeful thing they're doing while they're reading, which I find really interesting. You know, like I said, I very occasionally have a visual image when I read that's like a screenshot, but I'm not creating that consciously, and I can't create that consciously. Like even if I think really hard, I just can't like conjure up an image. That just isn't how my mind works. So I found that really, really interesting. I also found it really interesting, some people saying, you know, that they didn't realise that not everyone creates a mental image in their head because for them that's just completely natural. And I just find it really interesting that people's minds work in very different ways. I'll read out 2 comments that I found really interesting. One was, it really depends on the author though. They are the co-director of the film in my head. I just thought that was a really nice way of putting it. Not that it's describing something that I have experienced, but I just thought that was a really lovely way of like summing up how someone's visual imagination might work. And then another comment I found really interesting was, there are times when I feel like I'm watching a movie, especially when the book is written like that. So reading someone like Hemingway or Donna Tartt or even Tolkien is a breeze for me. So I found this really interesting because I haven't read any Tolkien yet, though I would like to, but I have read some Hemingway and some Donna Tartt, and they're 2 authors who I don't really get on with at all, whose writing styles are just not for me. And maybe that is because, like this person said, they write in a very visual way and I can't connect with that. Maybe there are certain literary writers who are a bit more visual and I just don't get on with that, and maybe when I say a book is too literary for me, maybe sometimes I mean it's too visual for me, I don't know. It was interesting that a lot of people said that they really love that they have a vivid visual imagination, and for them it's like a really big part of the joy of reading, which I guess makes me a little bit sad that I don't have that, but also like I still love reading hugely, and a lot of other people in the comments were saying that they loved reading and didn't have much of a visual imagination, and that never bothered them and, you know, never impacted their reading, you know, like I find. So I found that really, really interesting. Anyway, let's move on from talking about visualization to talking about subvocalization, because this is another topic that I find really interesting. So while I don't visualize anything really while I read, you know, like I said, 95 to 98% of the time I don't visualize anything when I read, but I do subvocalize. So subvocalization refers to when you speak or hear or sound out every word in your mind as you read. So when I read, I sort of hear or sound out every word in my head, sort of like I'm narrating the audiobook myself, but for the dialogue or for first-person narratives. I usually, I would say, have a voice in my head that is sort of separate from my own. And I feel like when I'm reading, that's me like consciously trying to do that. Whereas when I write, that's just what's happening in my head. And it's less conscious and more natural. I don't know if that's really true. Obviously, it's very hard to like make a distinction between what's conscious and what's natural. I don't know. But like when I write, I feel like I have the characters' voices in my head more distinct and more like fully separate voices than when I'm reading, but also it's less of an effort. I mean, it's not that big an effort to subvocalize when I read, like that is just naturally how I read, but I feel like maybe to have more distinct voices in dialogue and stuff is more like a conscious thing I am making an effort to do as I read, but also I have a much better audio imagination than I do a visual imagination. Like I do have an audio imagination, I can imagine different voices, and that kind of definitely makes an impact how I read. When I write, I do actually often vocalize rather than subvocalize. Like I often mutter to myself when I write, which I don't think I even realized for a long time until at one point I was, I think I like turned my camera on to film like something for a writing vlog or like a journey to publication vlog, and I was like, oh, I just sit there muttering to myself as I write. I also read my work aloud a lot when I edit, and I do put on different voices for the different characters, which on reflection makes me sound like exceptionally eccentric, but like that feels very natural to me, and I know what all my characters' voices sound like, even though I don't know what they look like. Moving back from writing to reading, when I read, I subvocalize, you know, I read out every word in my head, and for dialogue or first person narration, I do usually have like a slightly different voice or a slight like change to the voice, I suppose. I also usually try and subvocalize in like the correct accent for the character. So if I'm reading a book where like the main character is American or Scottish or whatever, then I will have that accent in my head as I read. It's probably not going to be like the best accent ever. It would probably be terrible if I tried to do it out loud, but like in my head it sounds as it should, and that often like helps with the reading experience. I would say that I usually have a relatively clear idea in my head of how characters sound, even if I have no idea what characters look like. So I would say that like when I'm reading, as a general rule, I subvocalize, but there are a couple of occasions when I don't subvocalize. I also didn't used to subvocalize. Like I remember as a child that I didn't really subvocalize much when I read, and in fact I used to skim read books a lot as a child and a kind of very early teen. I used to forget and miss things a lot, and I would subvocalize the dialogue, but that also meant that the dialogue was like the only bit I really read fully, because I think the rest of the time I would just like skip over the words a bit and not really take them in. I do think that there is definitely something in between subvocalizing and skim reading, but I think for me, maybe there isn't. Like I feel like for me, I'm subvocalizing or I'm skimming, and there's not like much space in between for me fully to take something in unless I'm subvocalizing it fully in my head. I really distinctly remember reading Jane Eyre when I was 13, and that was like one of the first books that I subvocalized like all the way through, because that made it easier for me to understand it, because I guess it was a slightly more tricky book than the books I had been reading, and it also just made it like a really rich, wonderful experience. Like I didn't want to miss a single word, and so I like read it aloud to myself in my head in a way that I didn't usually, and I remember that like really changed the reading experience, and it's probably one of the reasons why it's one of my favourite books. I would say that now I basically subvocalize all the time when I'm reading, except for on 2 occasions. So the first is non-fiction, and especially for when I'm doing historical research. So if I'm reading non-fiction like just for fun, I will try and subvocalize and I will read every word in my head to myself, although I do feel like I find it harder to stay focused on non-fiction, and I think one of the reasons why I prefer listening to non-fiction on audiobook than reading it physically is because I find it harder to focus on subvocalizing non-fiction. I think maybe because it's just my voice, not like a character's voice, because there isn't a character. So maybe my mind gets bored a bit more easily because there's like less variation in the subvocalization or the voices in my head. But also a lot of the non-fiction reading that I do physically is non-fiction reading that I'm doing for historical research. And when I'm doing historical research, I don't subvocalize all the time because I'm not reading every single word. I'm like skimming and looking for the bits that are relevant for what I'm researching. So usually if I'm reading a book for historical research, I will like read the introduction subvocalizing, and then some pages I'll read like in a more focused way, subvocalizing everything, and then some pages I'll just like skim through looking for keywords, and then stop and like read a paragraph subvocalizing, but I won't like subvocalize the whole thing. I read a lot of books for historical research, but I often don't read them all the way through, and I don't usually like mark them read on Goodreads or anything because I've had like a kind of different reading experience of them, I guess. And then the other time I kind of don't subvocalize is if I'm really not getting on with a book. Sometimes if I'm really struggling with a book, I sort of stop subvocalizing and I start to read the words, but I'm definitely not as engaged in them mentally, and maybe I'm skimming them a little bit, but I am still like getting the gist and what's happening, but I'm not like focused in the same way. It's almost like a half DNF for me because I don't DNF very often, and I feel like my sort of alternative to DNFing is I'm reading this book still, but I've stopped subvocalizing. So for example, last month I read the Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie, and I kind of was aware like a third of the way through that I was struggling with it a lot, and that there were a lot of things I just wasn't getting, that I wasn't hugely loving it. But it had also been on my TBR for a really long time, and I really wanted to finish it, and I also was aware that there were like 2 different strands to the story, and one strand I was getting something out of and one strand I wasn't really. So I kind of stopped subvocalizing on the strand that I wasn't as into. So I was still like reading it, like I was still, you know, using my bookmark, underlining every line, kind of looking at each line in turn, but it wasn't the same like fully subvocalized experience that I usually have when I'm reading. I don't know if that really makes sense, but I hope that does. Someone in one of the comments on the poll about this said that they wondered if one of the reasons why I read very quickly is because I talk very fast and therefore my subvocalization is probably very fast. And I do wonder if that's true. As I said, I read very quickly and I am subvocalizing, but I can subvocalize at a very quick rate because I talk exceptionally fast and my thoughts speak. Is that a thing? That's not a thing. My thought speech moves even faster than my actual speech. If you're watching this video, I digitally slow down all of my videos to 0.85 because I know I talk really quickly. So you're hearing me speak and I'm probably speaking quite fast, but this is actually only 85% of how fast I actually speak. And I speak even faster in my head. So I do wonder if my rapid speech and my inability to speak slowly does affect my subvocalization and how fast I read. All of the characters in every book I read probably talk very fast in my head because that's how I talk. Another thing that kind of came up in the comments about this was kind of inner monologues and how your mind works when you're not reading. Because apparently not everyone has an inner monologue, which I find really weird and strange. Probably in the same way that people with a very visual imagination find it strange that I don't like see images when I read. But I guess if you have a very visual imagination, then sometimes you can think in images. Whereas like, because I don't really have a visual imagination, or I definitely don't have very much of one, all my thoughts are words. So I don't know how it works for other people, but I have a constant inner monologue. Almost like my mind is a rather boring novel narrated in first-person present tense, interrupted from time to time with like rehearsals for booktube videos and stories I'm writing in my head. I have always written stories in my head. Like ever since I was a kid, I would write stories in my head, and that was always like subvocalized, not visually imagined. So, you know, I feel like some people who write novels, maybe they could have also written films or plays, drawn art, or like created music, like they could have done other things with the stories in their heads. But I feel like the stories in my head could only have ever been novels or short stories because that's what they are in my head. They're just words. They're not like scenes that I'm narrating. They are stories made of words that are in my head that I'm putting on the page. And I also feel like because I have an inner monologue and my brain is constantly talking to itself, I kind of have to subvocalize when I'm reading. Otherwise it's really hard to turn off my inner monologue, because usually my inner monologue is just going, but when I'm reading, my inner monologue switches off. And sometimes when I'm like watching TV or films or a really good play, like I can usually judge how like invested in something I am by whether my internal monologue like switches off or not. And I actually think one of the reasons why I really like listening to audiobooks or watching booktube while I'm like doing chores, exercising, cooking, cleaning, anything like that, I think it's because unless I'm doing those things, my internal monologue is like worrying about stuff. I also subvocalize as I type. Like I said, sometimes I speak aloud as I write, but I also definitely subvocalize and like hear my own voice as I type. Yes, for writing, but even if I'm just like writing an email or typing a text, I'm also subvocalizing then. I don't know if everyone is. I don't know if that's normal. I have no idea, but aren't minds fascinating? Anyway, this is gonna be such a long video. Let's move on to the poll I asked about subvocalization because I found this really, really interesting. So this is the poll I put up, and again we have a little booktube sample of 733 people, people who are probably more bookish and reading more books than average people, but you know, 733 people nonetheless answered this question, and I found it really interesting. So 62% of people said that they subvocalize most of the time when they read, kind of splits half and half between people who said it was like a full cast audiobook in their head and people who said that it wasn't. Lots of people did say in the comments as well that it was somewhere in between, and I feel like mine is somewhere in between. When I write, it's like a full cast audiobook. When I read, sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just like I put on a different voice for a character rather than like a full cast audiobook. Sometimes it is, but it kind of depends. Then 14% of people said they don't really subvocalize, 19% of people said it depends on the book or that they sometimes subvocalize, and 5% said they only subvocalize the dialogue. I found this really interesting, and the reason why I put the dialogue option on was because I know that that's what I used to do when I was a kid. It also kind of makes sense that like you would subvocalize the dialogue because those are the bits that are said aloud in the text, so they are kind of different. I guess actually it's quite a similar percentage of people said they subvocalized as said they have a very vivid visual imagination. Maybe I need to put a poll up to see whether there's a correlation or indeed a negative correlation between subvocalizing and having a visually vivid imagination. I found this poll really interesting, as I did with the last one, because I think I would have thought that it was a higher percentage of people who subvocalize when they read. In the same way that I was surprised by how many people said they had a vivid visual imagination, I was kind of expecting it to be a higher proportion of people who said that they subvocalize when they read. I think just because my experience of reading is not much visual imagination, lots of subvocalizing and audio imagination, and it's very hard to imagine what goes on in other people's heads. I found the comments really, really interesting on this poll. In the same way that some people said they couldn't imagine what it was like to read and not have a visually vivid imagination, lots of people said they couldn't imagine how you would read and what it would be like to read without subvocalization. Interestingly, quite a few people said that they had a very vivid visual imagination and don't subvocalize, and that it seemed for those people that those things were tied together. So for example, I'll read a couple of comments that I found interesting. The more immersed I am in a book, the less I think about what I'm reading, aside from absorbing the information. The faster I read and the less likely I am to be subvocalizing. It's a weird, almost unconscious state where that movie of images and sounds and details and action is playing out as I read, and I'm just sort of in it like a dream. That sounds fascinating. I'm so intrigued by this. Is that just how some people read? So maybe if you have a really vivid imagination, you don't subvocalize because the words just become images in your head as you read. This is fascinating. And someone else said, when I read, it usually feels like watching a film. It's like I see images and not the words on the page. Someone else said, I have an overly vivid imagination. It's like when I read, I'm watching a play or a movie. However, I never give much thought to voices. And then other people were saying that they do both. So they sort of like act out or subvocalize the dialogue in their minds. And then the descriptions like turn directly into images in their head. Some people said they like subvocalize at the beginning of a novel, and then the more they get into it, the less they need to subvocalize, or the less they do subvocalize. Some people said they subvocalize poetry but not novels, and that it depends on how quickly they're trying to read. And there was also an interesting discussion in the comments about like different kinds of subvocalization. So for some people it was a lot of voices, you know, full cast audiobook style, and for others it's not. And I also think a lot of people struggle to judge and articulate whether it was just their voice or whether they were hearing other voices, which I know I do. YouTube only allows you to have 5 options in polls, and I kind of wish it allowed you to have 10 because they would have done a lot more. Jennifer Loves Books, who again has done a really interesting video on this topic too, which I'll link down below, said that she subvocalizes, but it hadn't ever occurred to her that other people would like hear other voices for characters, and that it was always just her voice, which I found really interesting. So I think that's mostly what I wanted to say about subvocalization, but I have a few like other bits and pieces that I wanted to talk about which are kind of related to this. So some people in the comments on the polls and the video were talking about other senses when reading. So someone said that they can even like imagine smells when reading, which I found fascinating. Like I have none of that. I don't think I imagine tastes when reading either, but I definitely have like read books which have a lot of detail about food and it's made me feel hungry, but I don't think I'm really like imagining the taste so much as I'm just like thinking about food. I am sometimes aware of like some kind of other physical reaction to reading. So for example, if I'm reading like a really tense situation, you know, my heart will race. And if I'm reading a book that is very anxious, then sometimes I will feel anxious not just when I'm reading, but like the rest of the day. And I remember actually when I read The Wonder by Emma Donoghue, which is a fantastic work of historical fiction, but The Wonder is quite medical in some ways, I guess. It's about a nurse who has been sent to watch over a girl who claims she is surviving without eating. And so the book has a lot about not eating, a lot about starvation, a lot about what not eating could do to your body. And when reading The Wonder, I felt like dizzy and lightheaded all the time, like while reading, but also just like the rest of the day. Like I feel like the week I read The Wonder, I just felt like physically awful, which I feel is quite a weird, extreme reaction to have to The Wonder. I feel like that's a terrible way to recommend The Wonder. Read this book, it might make you feel ill, but like, that was a really like powerful sensation, which I guess that's not really the same as like visualization and subvocalization, but I guess that is kind of tied in. And I do notice like I have a knee injury, and if I read a book where a character has a knee or leg injury of some kind, my knee does hurt more. So I don't know how this ties into imagination, but sometimes you do get like a sensation communicated to you through a book, I guess. Maybe not everyone does. And then the other thing I kind of thought was maybe connected to some of these things somehow, I don't know, is that I'm like a very emotional reader. Like I reckon I cry or like at least tear up at more than half the books I read, which I feel is a bit excessive. And some of them it's not even that they're like devastatingly sad. I'm just like, that was a beautiful sentence, and then I just like start crying. I feel like I didn't used to do that as a child or a teenager. I feel like that's definitely an adult like change. But I do feel like really like emotionally, like physically emotionally invested in books. And I guess that is kind of related to how I experience reading. And I wonder if maybe because I don't have a visual imagination, I therefore like am compensating with like extra emotional imagination. I don't know. I've no idea if that's related to other things. But I kind of thought that was maybe interesting to talk about, like how emotion as well as senses might tie into your reading experience. I feel like that is enough of a ramble. I've been talking for nearly an hour and I've said lots of random stuff and I don't know if any of it made any sense. I feel like if I was someone who knew anything about psychology or had any background in psychology, wouldn't it be amazing to do a PhD that was like all about how people experience reading in their minds? Wouldn't that be fascinating? I'm not the person to do that at all, but I do find it really interesting to think about what goes on in your head when you read, and how that would affect your reading experience, and also maybe what kind of books you like and all of that kind of stuff. And also like, it's so hard to communicate what is going on in your head that it's really hard to conceive of how other people might experience reading. But I just feel like this is a really interesting topic, and I was kind of fascinated doing those polls last week. Like I feel like this is all I've been thinking about for the last week. So anyway, please do let me know down in your comments. Leave long, interesting, complicated comments about what your mind does when you read, because I would be fascinated to know, and we can have another long, interesting chat. Maybe I'll put up some more polls, I don't know. But anyway, that's all for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.